Our scripture reading today is Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 22. Then a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power over Egypt. He said to his people, "Look at the Israelite people. They are numerous and stronger than we are. Come, let's deal wisely with them. Otherwise, they will continue to multiply. And if a war breaks out, they will ally themselves with our enemies and fight against us and leave the country." So they put foremen over the Israelites to oppress them with hard labor. As a result, they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread. As a result, the Egyptians loathed the Israelites, and they made the Israelites serve rigorously. They made their lives bitter by hard service with mortar and bricks and by all kinds of service in the fields. Every kind of service the Israelites were required to give was rigorous. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you assist the Hebrew women in childbirth, observe at the delivery. If it is a son, kill him. But if it is a daughter, she may live." But the midwives feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and let the boys live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. For the Hebrew women are vigorous. They give birth before the midwife gets to them." So God treated the midwives well, and the people multiplied and became strong. And because the midwives feared God, He made households for them. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "All sons that are born you must throw into the river, but all daughters you may let live." May the Lord add His blessing to the reading and the hearing of His word. And yes, this scripture, I know it's not a typical Mother's Day scripture reading, but trust me, we're going to get there. I think this is one of the most powerful passages in the Bible, this and the beginning of chapter 2 of Exodus, on mothers and motherhood. And we're going to talk about that. Mothers, midwives, and a hand to hold. Having that hand to hold is such an important thing. It's not always visible. It's seldom dramatic. It's seldom on the news. It's seldom spotlighted on a social media influencer's podcast or TikTok or whatever they happen to be doing. But it's more important than 99% of the things that happen in the spotlight. So we're going to talk about it today. We're going to talk about the context first. First of all, this is one of those stories that we almost never hear about in the Bible. Would you be willing, I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad, but would you be willing to raise your hand if you have never heard that story of Shiphrah and Puah and the midwives before? If you've never heard that, anyone? Got a few folks that have never heard it. It's the only place it's not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. Shiphrah and Puah are mentioned no other place. This incident of the midwives being instructed by the Pharaoh to kill the baby boys as they are born is mentioned nowhere else in the Bible. It's the only place we see it. And yet I think it's an extraordinary story that we need to hear. And I feel like should become a regular part of the spiritual diet of followers of Jesus because of the power and the significance that's in it. As I said, we're working our way through the Bible. We started in Genesis chapter 1 a couple weeks ago. We're jumping out of order because of Mother's Day here. We want to honor Mother's Day. But I wanted to pick a passage that was not only powerful, but also maybe one you hadn't heard as much before. But let's get the context. The context is that the children of Israel are in Egypt. They are in slavery. They have been in Egypt for around 400 years at this time. About 400 years before this, Joseph had his dream that his brothers would one day bow down to him. His brothers, oddly enough, did not like that dream. They took a rather extreme step and sold their little brother into slavery. They sold him to a group of Ishmaelites who were passing through Canaan. The Ishmaelites were on their way down to Egypt. When they got to Egypt, they sold Joseph to Potiphar. He became Potiphar's slave, and he excelled as one of Potiphar's slaves and was given great responsibility in Potiphar's house until Potiphar's wife hit on Joseph. Joseph declined her advances. Potiphar was nonetheless displeased, and rather than divorcing his wife, he got rid of his slave and sent him to jail. And Joseph wound up in prison, where once again he excelled and he advanced and was given great responsibility there. And he interpreted dreams while he was there, and his ability to accurately interpret dreams brought him to the attention of someone who brought him to the attention of Pharaoh, the king at the time, who had had a very disturbing dream. No one could interpret it. Joseph interpreted and gave him the interpretation to Pharaoh that God had given him. And because of that interpretation, Pharaoh, with Joseph's aid and assistance, was able to save much of his kingdom from perishing in a great famine that lasted many, many, many years. In gratitude for all that Joseph had done to help Pharaoh and the nation of Egypt, the Pharaoh advanced Joseph to the second in command. He allowed Joseph to bring his family down from Canaan. They were able to live in Egypt and survive the famine as well. And they just stayed there long after the Pharaoh died, long after Joseph died, long after Joseph's father Jacob died. They stayed in Egypt. They grew. They prospered for 400 years. And then there came that Pharaoh who did not remember what Joseph had done. Now, the odds that he wouldn't have actually remembered what Joseph had done, that to be taking that literally, are slim. That kind of event would have been shared, would have been part of the lore, particularly of the pharaohs and the other learned people in the kingdom to know about it. The indication here is really that it no longer really mattered to him. That what had happened was so long ago. What do we really owe these people now? In fact, they've grown numerous, they've grown prosperous. They're a threat to us, these foreigners living inside of our borders. They might turn against us. They might ally with our enemies and help overthrow us. And so they enslaved the Hebrews there in the land of Egypt. But the Hebrews still grew, and they still prospered, and they still advanced. And so the Pharaoh said, we can't have this, these foreigners growing and advancing and prospering in our midst. And so he called the Hebrew midwives. Now, their estimates vary as to how many Hebrews there were enslaved in Egypt at that time, how many Israelites. If you take biblical accounts literally and the numbers they project, there were maybe 1.5 million of them. Historically, that would have meant there were more Israelites in Egypt than there were in many large kingdoms. Total people in many large kingdoms in the day. So if that's true, they were a huge group of people. Other folks suggest it might have been as few as 20 to 40,000 Israelites. We don't know. What we do know, whether it was 20,000 Israelites or 1.5 million Israelites, it takes more than 2 midwives to tend to that many births that are happening. And so Shiphrah and Puah that are mentioned are most likely like elders or supervisors among the midwives, chief midwives, if you will. And they got called before the king. And the king gave him a very simple instruction that any midwife could follow. When you see the baby that is born, if it's a boy, kill the baby. If it's a girl, let her live. Tell the mom it was a stillbirth. It's brutal. It's evil. It's inhumane. But what choice did Puah and Shiphrah have? Pharaoh was the king, most powerful person in one of the most powerful kingdoms in all of the world, known and unknown to them at the time. He had all the authority, he had all the might, he had all the control, he had all the power in his hands. What could they do? Pharaoh wanted him to be afraid of him. He thought they would be afraid of him. Most people called before Pharaoh would have been afraid of him. And I think Shiphrah and Puah were afraid of him. But the Bible tells us they were more afraid of God. They were more afraid of what God would say than what the Pharaoh would say. They were more afraid of how God would respond to them than how Pharaoh would respond to them. And so they declined to do what the Pharaoh ordered them to do. When the babies were born, they let them live, all of them. And when Pharaoh called them on the carpet for it, they just told him a bald-faced lie. Oh, look, sorry, Pharaoh, you don't understand Hebrew women. They're really tough. Baby's out before we ever get there. The midwives, they don't really need us. We just show up to kind of clean up afterwards. There's nothing we can really do. Whether the Pharaoh believed it or not, we don't know. But the women did that. Shiphrah and Puah, whose names are mentioned nowhere else in the entire Scripture, stood up to the most powerful king in the land and led the other midwives to stand up to him as well. It was an incredible act of courage, an incredible act of bravery, what Shiphrah, Puah, and the other midwives did. They risked their lives to take the hand of a generation of Israelite boys and lead them into life. At great risk to their own. Now, it is possible, given what happened next, to say, did it really matter? Were their efforts futile? Did it make any difference at all? Because after they told their lie to the Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said, okay, we'll just make a new plan. And he passed a law and authorized, indeed commanded, everyone in his kingdom, if you see a Hebrew baby boy, throw him in the river. Baby girls, that's all right. If you see a Hebrew baby boy, throw him in the river. So does that mean that what Shiphrah and Puah did and the other midwives did was useless, was futile? They didn't overthrow the king. They didn't end the system of oppression. They didn't set their people free from slavery. They didn't lead their people to escape bondage. They didn't overthrow the government. They didn't lead any massive demonstrations. Nothing really had changed. Hebrew baby boys were still under the threat and condemnation of death by order of the king. But it was not in the least bit futile. It was not in the least bit useless. Part of the reason we know that is what God said. God said this, I love it. True courage, before we get to what God said. The courage and faith that it took them. First of all, they refused to participate in the evil that they were told to do. There's a lot of that in the world. A lot of voices that tell us to do things that are evil. A lot of voices that tell us to do things that are wrong. But rarely do we have something so focused, so direct, so immediate as the king of the most powerful kingdom in the world telling you to do an evil thing, and you have to decide whether to risk your life and follow the king's instructions or risk your soul and follow what you know God is calling you to do. And Shiphrah and Puah risked their lives to be faithful to God. And they refused to participate in the evil of murder and infanticide, and they did what they could to hinder it. They couldn't stop it all. They couldn't overthrow the king. They couldn't change the law. They couldn't free their entire nation from the situation that they were in. But in the situation they were in, they did what they could do to hinder the evil that they were commanded to be a part of. They didn't participate. They got in the way. God's response. God was very, very pleased. We know that because the Bible tells us God was pleased. God treated the midwives well. And the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, He made households for them. Now that word households, it's an interesting word in Hebrew. In almost every English translation of the Bible you will read, it translates that, it says, God made families for them. And that's how I was taught it when I was growing up. This is one of the passages we studied when I was a student down at a High Valley Christian school. And I was told that it was families, that God gave Puah and Shiphrah children of their own. And I was told on top of that, because it was a tradition among the Hebrews, that it was childless women who were midwives. I have since learned there is zero evidence whatsoever that it was a tradition among Hebrews for midwives to be childless women. They were probably women who had had children of their own, maybe past childbearing ages, but had children of their own. I think, I'm not a mom, never given birth. Going to be clear about that right up front. I'm assuming you want a midwife who knows what you're going through in that situation, not someone who doesn't. In Hebrew, the word is not families. In Hebrew, the word is quite simply house. God gave them a house of their own. Now, we can, I think, legitimately interpret that as meaning families. I think one thing we can safely rule out is God did not bless them with real estate. I got a nice little bungalow for you, Cape Cod, down near the Mediterranean Sea. It's a beautiful spot. You can watch the birds. It's not what God blessed them with. There is a tradition among the ancient and modern rabbis and commentators on this scripture. And they like to translate that literally, or read that word literally. For them, they're not translating it, they're just reading it. God made a house for them. And they say that house is just like the word house that's used for dynastic houses. So, if you're a Game of Thrones fan, think House Targaryen or House Stark. If you think House Lannister, you can leave now. There's no room for you here. If you don't get that joke, that's okay. I have a friend of mine that says, always include a joke that only you get. That's one of them. If you're a Tolkien fan, think of House Elendil, the House of Elendil. That Aragorn, son of Arathorn, was part of House Elendil, and that gave him authority to become the king in the end. Or, if you're more interested in all things British, then think of the Stuarts, think of the Windsors, think of the Tudors. These were all dynastic houses in the nation of England. And so, what many of the rabbis say is that what God did for these women was give them essentially dynasties of their own. And in context, there's a certain amount of sense to that, because the very beginning of the book of Exodus is a list of the dynastic houses of the nation of Israel, the heads of the 12 tribes, Dan and Asher and Zebulun and Naphtali and Ephraim and Levi and Judah and others. They're mentioned at the beginning of Exodus. They've been dead for 400 years. And they are listed there. And now we hear God saying, I'll give a house to you as well for what you have done. What they had done is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And in partnership with 3 other women at the beginning of Exodus chapter 2, whoa, that was impressive. That was well done. Well done. I burp during the message too sometimes, and you can only hear it on the microphone, but there you go. Exodus chapter 2, we hear about Jochebed, Miriam, and Pharaoh's daughter, 3 other women. 3 other women who risked their own lives to take the hand of the defenseless. Jochebed gave birth to a son after Pharaoh's order that all male babies, Hebrew babies to be born, are to be thrown into the river. She gave birth to a son, but like any mother, she didn't want to throw her baby in the river. He was dear to her. She loved him. She looked at him and, like every mom, said, there's something special about this one. And she hid him for as long as she could hide him. And then when she couldn't hide him anymore, with a heart broken and torn in grief, she followed the letter of what Pharaoh did, the letter of it, but not the spirit of it. She put him in the river. But first, she made a basket. She coated the basket with pitch so that it would float like a little boat. And then she placed him in the river in a spot near the bank, near where she knew Pharaoh's daughter was on her way. And then her daughter Miriam, Jochebed's daughter Miriam, hid to watch what would happen. And Jochebed said, maybe Pharaoh's daughter will have mercy on my son. Now, Pharaoh's daughter was under the command of the king like everyone. Remember, everybody, is what the command said, is to kill the Hebrew baby boys. But Pharaoh's daughter saw the baby in the basket, and her heart went out. And she took hold of that baby. She took his hand now. And she made him safe. And then Miriam jumped out of hiding and said, hey, dear Miss Honorable Princess, I'm not sure how you dressed the Pharaoh's daughter in those days, Would you like me to find a Hebrew woman who can nurse the baby for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said yes, and Miriam got Jochebed, who took her son back home and nursed him and raised him till he was old enough to be weaned. And then he was sent to live in the palace with Pharaoh's daughter. If you haven't guessed or don't know already, that little baby was none other than Moses himself. Now, what these women did was extraordinary. I did slides a little bit differently for each service today, and I can't remember. Yeah, I got there. I don't want to go there yet. So, what they did was extraordinary. But it wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exciting. This wasn't Moses holding his staff out over the Nile River and the river turning to blood for everyone to see. This wasn't Moses holding his staff out over the Red Sea and the waters parting so they could walk through on dry land, and then holding his staff out again and the waters crashing back in and wiping out the Pharaoh's army. It wasn't Moses on top of Mount Sinai with the thunder and the lightning and the storm clouds receiving stone tablets written on by the very hand of God, God's way for his people to live. It wasn't Joseph taking the staff of Moses and holding it over the Jordan River so God's people could cross on dry land. It wasn't Joseph leading God's people in a march around the city of Jericho for 7 days until the walls just tumbled down. Those are dramatic. Those are flashy. Those are the things people write books about and movies about and stories about. What these women did was so quiet and so subtle and so gentle. And yet, none of those other things could have happened but for these women. But for these women, there would have been no Moses to hold his staff over the Nile River, to hold his staff over the Red Sea, to hold his staff over to strike the rock and bring out the water, to stand on Mount Sinai and receive God's way from the hand of God himself. There would have been no Joshua. These women courageously, daringly reached down to take the hands of these defenseless little boys and saved an entire generation, saved an entire nation because of what they did. With no flash, no bang, no spotlights, no celebration. They just did what they did in the sphere in which they could act, and that made all the difference in the world. And that's why I think one of the reasons this passage is so important is because most of us aren't Moses, right? I'm not Moses. If any of you are Moses, let me know. I'm excited to know that. Most of us aren't Joshua. Most of us aren't doing the flash and the bang and the big and the dramatic. Most of us don't have the opportunity to lead an entire nation of people into freedom. Most of us aren't Moses. But we can all be like Jochebed and Miriam and Pharaoh's daughter and Shiphrah and Puah. We can all reach down and take the hand of the defenseless and shield them and care for them and protect them and breathe into them the love and the hope and the promise of God. We can all do that in whatever sphere, wherever we are. I've been working through a book here recently, I listen to a lot of books these days. I love listening to a good audiobook. And I'm listening to one now that is at once one of the most important books I think I've ever listened to, and one of the hardest. It's called Of Democracies and Death Cults by Douglas Murray. I haven't quite finished it yet. When I do, I'll probably put up a little, thing on Facebook saying, check this out. Douglas Murray is a long-time, deeply committed journalist who spent a lot of time in the Middle East. And this is not about being partisan, it's not about being political. But he's followed the IDF into Palestine as they have searched through looking for Hamas in their war against Hamas. And he's been to the areas, the kibbutzes, where Hamas came and murdered and raped and killed, and women, children, babies, elderly. And he's got the stories of both sides, not both sides, of both situations. And he tells all these stories that he's heard firsthand or that he's seen the evidence of his own eyes, of these mothers and fathers as well, who did everything they could to protect their children. Parents throwing themselves on hand grenades. Parents standing in front of doors that were being shot through by machine guns to protect their children. And sometimes they did protect their children, and sometimes their children were killed anyway. And he said, when they went in and they were looking for Hamas, and they went into the homes where looking for places where Hamas had hidden explosive devices, bombs, grenades, or other kinds of weapons, and entrances to tunnels, their underground network of tunnels. And the IDF said that they learned very quickly, after searching for just a short time, that when they went into a house, they didn't go to the living room, they didn't go to the family room, they didn't go to the kitchen. If they wanted to find weapons, bombs, and tunnels, they went to the nurseries. They went to the children's rooms, where they found the entrances to the tunnels. And bombs and grenades and other kinds of weapons hidden beneath the beds of children. And Murray made this comparison, which I think is incredibly powerful and is a rendering of this story in modern day of Shifra and Puah and Yocheved and Miriam and Pharaoh's daughter and into our modern context. That in one of those cultures, parents were dying to protect their children. In another situation, terrorists were using children to protect their bombs. This is the choice that we have. We can use our children to shield us, or we can shield our children. We can use our children as tools, or we can take the hands of our children and give them peace and hope and life and space. We can follow in the example of the Pharaoh of ages past or Pharaoh's ages present, who want to steal, kill, and destroy. Or we can follow in the footsteps of Shifra and Puah and Yocheved and Miriam and Pharaoh's daughter and take the hands of the defenseless and watch over them with love and care in whatever context we're in. Miriam couldn't do what Yocheved did. Yocheved couldn't do what Shifra and Puah did. Shifra and Puah couldn't do what Pharaoh's daughter did. In their situations, they did what they could to take the hand of the defenseless around them, like mothers, like our mothers have done for us. Like the mothers among us, you have done for your kids and your grandkids and your neighbor kids and your nieces and nephews and so many others. Let's follow in the footsteps of these mothers and midwives and hold the hands of those around us because, well, we'll sing the song and then I'll give the because in the blessing. Let's stand and sing together.